UNLV Microcertificate Economics. The United States has treaties with over 100 countries that define our trade relationships between those countries. And we have a few joint treaties that work between us and a group of other countries. The most famous of that is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. It was signed by Bill Clinton there. You can see him, 1994. It effectively removed tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It allowed some other trade barriers to continue. So throughout all of NAFTA, we had quotas on wood from Canada, and they stopped dairy products from us, and there were certain things, and wood and dairy are the two most obvious of those things. But there were certain trade issues that weren't resolved and were never resolved over the years. It's not a perfect agreement. Barack Obama, during his campaign for president, his first campaign, said he would renegotiate NAFTA within his first 6 months in office, and he never renegotiated NAFTA. But it didn't do anything about intellectual property issues. It didn't do anything about environmental concerns. We had lots of polluting factories in the United States in 1993 that simply picked up and moved across the river into Mexico. So they were in the south part of Texas or the south part of California, and they just moved into California. So instead of cleaning up the air and cleaning up pollution, they were able to move to Mexico, and in fact they could pollute more than they were because they were in Mexico. Okay? So when we look at this in retrospect, some industries that were involved in this lost, and the automobile industry is a perfect example of that. Lots of jobs in the auto industry moved to Mexico. But other industries gained, and I'll give you a little look at some of what that might be when we do the overall analysis. And in fact, Obama admitted during his campaign, he gave a speech in Ohio, and one of the questions was, hey, we just did a big study in Ohio, and Ohio has benefited from NAFTA. And he admitted that that was true, but he still wanted to renegotiate it. Overall, we believe that there was a small increase in U.S. GDP from NAFTA. So U.S. companies could sell stuff into NAFTA and not have to pay tariffs. Mexican companies could sell stuff here, back and forth with Canada. Okay? Just a quick look just at the energy sector. Okay? So remember that everything's complicated now. If there's no taxes moving stuff back and forth across the border, you're going to buy stuff where you can get it the cheapest and the easiest, and you're not going to drive something all the way across Canada if you can get it from just across the border in the United States. So we can look, for example, and see that we bought $50 billion worth of oil from Canada. This is 2017, which is the last beautiful graphic I could find. We bought $50 billion in oil from Canada, and we sold them $6 billion worth of oil. Yeah. And you say, why don't they... Again, you're going to get that oil and move it where it's convenient. We bought another $9 billion from Mexico, so in total we bought $60 billion worth of oil, and we sold $6 billion worth of crude oil. This is unrefined crude oil. Refined oil products, we didn't buy any... Well, let me take that back. We bought $10 billion in refined oil products from Canada and $1.2 billion in refined oil products from Mexico. And we sold them $30 billion of refined oil products. And again, we probably sold them different things that maybe we bought asphalt or they bought. Mexico probably bought a lot of the chemicals that are the base products for making plastics, for example. And so we bought $2.5 trillion worth of electricity from Canada, and they bought $200 million of electricity from us. And you're like, wait. Yeah. So natural gas, we sold $2.8 billion worth of natural gas to Canada, and we bought $9.4 billion in natural gas from Canada. We sold Mexico $4.5 billion worth of natural gas, and we bought $34 million from them. So it creates these complicated and really interesting trade interactions where we sent them a whole lot of money buying oil. They sent us on net balance, a whole bunch of money buying petroleum products, buying natural gas. Okay? And so these things can sort of have a tendency to balance themselves out. Donald Trump campaigned on how evil NAFTA was and how evil something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTP, was, which he said, I'm not going to sign, I'm going to cancel. Obama had negotiated this thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And both Trump and Hillary said, oh, I'm not going to sign it, I'm going to read it. But anyway, let's see. So we replaced NAFTA with something called the U.S.-Mexico Canada Agreement, which I hate that because that's a Marine Corps, and they shouldn't call something after the USMC. But anyway, and that's the President of Mexico, Donald Trump, and the Prime Minister of Canada, and they're signing it. Okay, it's passed by Congress in 2020. All these things have to get approved by Congress. The President can't do it by him or herself. Mostly, again, took away the tariffs. There's rules by which you can put little tariffs in, but it adds intellectual property. So for the first time, there's intellectual property. They can't steal our patents, use our copyrights, all that kind of stuff. It did not add anything about all the environmental problems. And you wouldn't have expected that from a Republican administration, but they didn't do anything about the environmental issues with Mexico. They changed because the automobile industry was the most effective. And I'm only talking about the American side of this, right? We did things, we gave Canada things, we gave Mexico things. For us, the big thing that we added was raising. The Democrats refused to sign the agreement. The original terms of the agreement that Trump came up with, the Democrats refused. And they wanted protections for workers. They wanted to do something for not the auto companies, but the auto workers. So the Democrats said, if this doesn't make life better for our auto workers, we're not signing it. So they went back and they said that a minimum of 40% of the parts in cars sold in the United States have to be made by North American workers, that's the U.S., Canada, or Mexico, making at least $16 an hour. Now, you can import a car from Japan that has no U.S. content in it, but then you have to pay a tariff. You could actually import a car from Mexico that was made by $4 an hour labor, but you'd have to pay a huge tariff on it. So 40% of the parts are North American workers making $16 an hour or more. Typical pay in Mexican auto factories is $3 to $4 an hour. So it's going to force some workers in Mexico are going to get a huge raise. Their salaries, their wages are going to quadruple. And the hope is that some parts will get made in the U.S. by workers who are making, $16 or $17 or $18 an hour. How much of that comes to pass, we don't know. There are none so far, right? It's been the pandemic, and there hasn't really been all that much change. Most of us are not expecting that to do anything but make Mexican workers happy. But it was an attempt by the Democrats to actually do something for the workers, for the labor in the factories, not just to improve the profits of the auto companies. And we used to have, NAFTA has a requirement that to avoid tariffs, 62.5% of the content of a vehicle has to be made in North America. I owned a Honda Civic. It was actually made in Canada. It was 65% North American content, but the vast majority of that content was Canadian, actually. So it met the minimum requirement. Now that requirement is going from 62.5% to 75%, so that increases the amount of North American content. to avoid the tariff. So, all good there, yes? Now, the two interesting things about this. One is that a lot of the language in the USMCA is straight out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, cut and pasted out of the TPP. So we didn't like the TPP, right? Trump said, I'm not going to sign it. Hillary said, I'm not going to sign it. It's a terrible agreement. And then they cut it and pasted it to make the USMCA, parts of the USMCA. So it must not have been that bad. They were playing political games, as politicians do, both of them, and use the TPP. The problem with us getting out of the TPP then is that China basically filled our hole there in the TPP. And, for example, Welch's can't sell grape juice into Canada, and we might have talked about this already, but Welch's can't sell grape juice into Canada because we have to pay a tariff on grape juice or not Canada, Japan. We have to pay a tariff to import grape juice into Japan. Chile does not have to pay a tariff to import their grape juice into Japan, and U.S. grape juice is basically out of that market. The other part of this, of course, is that consumer prices are going to rise. As we increase the wages of the workers who are building the cars, consumers are going to have to pay more for cars. So the USMCA is going to raise prices on things that are covered by it for consumers. The other big deal that we did was we signed this alleged agreement with China. China agreed to pay more. Remember, but what happens when we start a trade war with China? We put on tariffs on things that we don't want China to do. They stop buying soybeans from us. Farm income in the United States fell by over 20% the year after the trade war started. Over 20%. And farmers were going out of business right and left. Trump administration subsidized farmers $18 billion to try to keep them solvent, but we still had a record number of small farmers went bankrupt. Okay? So Trump signed a deal with China. They agreed to buy more stuff from us if there's market demand. Eased licensing requirements for farmers to sell into China, did not do anything about intellectual property, did not do anything about exchange rates. So the things that are driving us really long-term to have problems with China is the lack of intellectual property protection. So China doesn't allow companies, and we'll talk about this some more here, but China doesn't allow companies to operate in China without having a Chinese partner. So Airbus comes in, they build a factory in China. That teaches the Chinese how to build commercial airliners, and now they're in the commercial airliner business. They steal our intellectual property, our patents, our ideas, our techniques. And they manipulate their exchange rates. Donald Trump said, the day I become president, I'm going to declare China a currency manipulator, and again, never did that. Not that we really expect politicians to ever do what they said. There's no enforcement mechanism in this deal, and there was no. So China didn't do anything that's required in this deal. They didn't buy a single piece of food because of it. They did absolutely nothing. It had zero impact, except it was good public relations for both countries. Right? No impact. It's a worthless deal that politicians do, so it looks like they're doing something. But these deals aren't enforceable. How do you force a country to keep a contract? If you and I make a contract, I can take you to court. How do you make a government? Yeah, okay? So these things are very complex. That's the whole point, and we're going to talk about these trade controls more here in a second.